Colt Brennan, Hawaii. Let's start with probably the most obvious one, but also the most criminally underrated. Colt Brennan at Hawaii wasn't just good. He was putting up numbers that seemed like a typo. In 2006, this guy threw for 5,549 yards and 58 touchdowns. That's more than most teams score in total touchdowns for an entire season. But here's the thing that'll blow your mind. Brennan did this while playing for a Hawaii team that went 11-3, which sounds pretty good until you realize they were playing in the WAC against teams that most people couldn't find on a map. The level of competition was, let's be honest, not exactly SEC caliber. But the numbers don't lie, and neither does the tape. Brennan had this quick release that was absolutely beautiful to watch. The guy could thread passes into windows that looked impossible, and he had this uncanny ability to read defenses pre-snap that reminded you of the elite NFL quarterbacks. His 2007 season might have been even more impressive. 4,343 yards and 38 touchdowns while leading Hawaii to an undefeated regular season and a Sugar Bowl appearance. Now, imagine if Brennan had been playing at Texas or Florida during those years. With that kind of talent around him, with those recruiting classes, with that level of coaching, we might be talking about him in the same breath as guys like Vince Young or Tim Tebow. Instead, he's a footnote in college football history, remembered mainly by people who stayed up late watching Hawaii games on ESPN2. The crazy part is that Brennan's Hawaii teams actually had some success, which makes you wonder what he could have done with a real defense behind him. In 2007, Hawaii gave up over 30 points per game, which meant Brennan basically had to throw for 400 yards just to keep them competitive. The guy was playing quarterback and offensive coordinator at the same time, audibling out of plays, extending drives with his legs when the pocket collapsed, and somehow making it all look effortless. Seneca Wallace, Iowa State. Let's talk about a guy who might have had the most underrated two-year run in college football history. Seneca Wallace at Iowa State wasn't just putting up good numbers. He was single-handedly dragging a historically terrible program to respectability and doing it in a way that was absolutely beautiful to watch. Wallace could do everything. The guy threw for over 5,000 yards and rushed for nearly 1,000 yards in just 2 seasons as a starter. He was putting up some wild numbers as both a passer and a runner while playing for a team that had won maybe 10 games total in the 5 years before he got there. The 2002 season was Wallace's masterpiece. Iowa State went 7-7, which sounds mediocre until you realize they'd gone 9-26 in the 3 seasons before Wallace became the starter. He threw for 3,245 yards and 15 touchdowns, while rushing for 437 yards and 8 more scores. The guy was a fun watch as a dual threat at quarterback. What made Wallace special wasn't just his athleticism, though he was probably one of the more athletic quarterbacks in college football during his era. It was his ability to make something out of nothing. Iowa State's offensive line was terrible. Their receivers were okay at best, and their running game was non-existent without Wallace carrying the ball. But somehow, he made it all work. The really frustrating part about Wallace's college career is that he was doing all of this while playing in the Big 12, against defenses that were loaded with future NFL players. He was going up against Oklahoma and Texas and Nebraska every year and somehow keeping Iowa State competitive with teams that had way more talent. What if Wallace had been playing for a program with better resources, better recruiting, better everything? With his combination of arm strength, mobility, and football IQ, might he have been putting up Heisman-type numbers? Instead, he's remembered mainly by Iowa State fans and people who appreciate what it takes to elevate a terrible program. If you're enjoying these forgotten legends, make sure to stick around because we're just getting started with some truly insane stories. Case Keenum, Houston. Let's talk about a guy who might have had the most underrated college career in recent memory. Case Keenum at Houston put up numbers that were absolutely ridiculous, but because he was playing in Conference USA, nobody really paid attention until it was too late. Keenum threw for 19,217 yards in his college career. That's more than some NFL quarterbacks throw for in their entire professional careers. He also had 155 touchdown passes and completed over 70% of his passes for his career. The 2009 season was probably Keenum's breakout year. Houston went 10-4, and Keenum threw for 5,671 yards and 51 touchdowns. But the crazy part is that Houston's defense was so bad that Keenum basically had to throw for 400 yards every game just to keep them competitive. The guy was playing quarterback and trying to outscore everyone at the same time. What made Keenum special was his accuracy and his ability to read defenses. The guy could find the open receiver in any coverage, and he had this knack for making throws that looked impossible. He wasn't the biggest guy, he wasn't the strongest arm, but he understood the game at a level that most college quarterbacks never reach. Houston during Keenum's era was always entertaining, but never quite good enough to break through to the next level. They'd score 50 points and somehow give up 55. They'd put together these incredible offensive performances and then watch their defense give it all back in the fourth quarter. The really frustrating part about Keenum's college career is that he was doing all of this while playing for coaches who understood how to use his talents. Kevin Sumlin was running an offense that was perfectly suited to Keenum's skill set, and the results were obvious. But because Houston wasn't in a major conference, nobody really cared until Keenum started having success in the NFL years later. Ryan Dinwiddie, Boise State. Before Boise State became the giant killer we know today, they had a quarterback who was putting up numbers that nobody was paying attention to. Ryan Dinwiddie threw for nearly 10,000 yards in his college career and had 82 touchdown passes. But because Boise State was in a small conference, nobody outside of Idaho knew who he was. Dinwiddie was running an offense that was ahead of its time. Boise State was throwing the ball all over the field using concepts that wouldn't become mainstream until years later. The guy was basically playing 2010 college football in 2003, and he was doing it better than most of the quarterbacks who were getting all the attention. The 2003 season was Dinwiddie's masterpiece. He threw for 4,356 yards and 31 touchdowns while leading Boise State to a 13-1 record and a bowl victory. But the crazy part is that this was before Boise State had the resources and the reputation they have now. Dinwiddie was doing this with players who were mostly overlooked by major programs. What's really impressive about Dinwiddie is that he was the guy who helped establish the foundation for what Boise State would become. The success they had in the mid-2000s, the Fiesta Bowl victory, the national recognition, a lot of that started with what Dinwiddie was doing in the early 2000s. It is interesting to think of what Dinwiddie might have accomplished with better talent around him, more resources, and national television coverage. We might be talking about him as one of the pioneers of modern college football offense. Instead, he's a footnote in Boise State history, remembered mainly by people who were paying attention to mid-major football before it became cool. David Klingler, Houston. Let's go back a little further and talk about a guy who was putting up insane numbers before anyone knew what to do with them. David Klingler at Houston was throwing for over 5,000 yards in a season when most teams were still running the wishbone. The guy was basically playing a different sport than everyone else. In 1990, Klingler threw for 5,140 yards and 54 touchdowns. This was 1990, remember, when most college offenses were still trying to establish the run and control the clock. Klingler was out there throwing the ball 60 times a game and making it look easy. Houston, during Klingler's era, was running the run-and-shoot offense, which was college football's version of organized chaos. The guy had to make reads on every single play, adjust routes based on what the defense was doing, and somehow make it all work while defensive coordinators were trying to figure out how to stop something they'd never seen before. The crazy part about Klingler is that he was doing all of this while playing for a Houston team that was always good enough to be dangerous, but never quite good enough to win the big one. What's really frustrating about Klingler's college career is that he was ahead of his time by about 20 years. The concepts he was running, the numbers he was putting up, the way he was reading defenses, all of that would be considered normal today. But in 1990, it was new, and nobody really knew how to appreciate what they were watching. DeAngelo Williams, Memphis. Let's talk about a running back who put up numbers that were absolutely ridiculous but might not be appreciated to the level it should be because Memphis was in Conference USA. DeAngelo Williams rushed for 6,026 yards in his college career and had 55 rushing touchdowns. But more importantly, he was doing it while carrying a Memphis team that had no business being competitive. Williams wasn't just putting up good numbers, he was single-handedly keeping Memphis relevant in a way that seemed impossible. The guy would rush for 150-plus yards, and somehow Memphis would still find ways to lose games with their passing game being basically non-existent. His 2004 and 2005 seasons were statistically very similar in greatness. In 2004, he rushed for 1,948 yards and 22 touchdowns, while averaging over 6 yards per carry. While in 2005, he returned with 1,964 yards and 18 touchdowns. And his production was this consistent while facing 8-man boxes every play. Memphis couldn't throw the ball, so defensive coordinators would literally stack the box and dare Memphis to beat them through the air. And Williams would still find ways to break off 60-yard runs. What made Williams special wasn't just his speed, it was his vision and his ability to make something out of nothing. Memphis's offensive line was okay at best, and Williams was constantly having to make defenders miss in the backfield before he could even get to the line of scrimmage. The really frustrating part about Williams' college career is that he was doing all of this while playing for a program that didn't have the resources to build around him properly. Memphis was always competitive enough to be dangerous, but they never had the depth or the talent to make a real run at anything significant. Imagine if Williams had been playing for a team like USC or Miami during those years. With a decent offensive line, with a passing game that could keep defenses honest, with a defense that could occasionally get a stop, we might be talking about him breaking every rushing record in college football history. Instead, he's remembered mainly by people who were paying attention to Conference USA football in the mid-2000s. Byron Leftwich, Marshall. Marshall had a quarterback who was putting up numbers that nobody outside of West Virginia was paying attention to. Byron Leftwich threw for 11,903 yards in his college career and had 89 touchdown passes, but he was doing it for a Marshall program that was still trying to establish itself after moving up from Division I AA. Leftwich had one of the strongest arms in college football history. The guy could throw the ball 70 yards downfield and make it look effortless, and he had this ability to fit passes into windows that looked impossible. But what made him really special was his leadership and his ability to elevate everyone around him. The 2001 season was Leftwich's masterpiece. Marshall went 11-2, and Leftwich threw for 4,708 yards and 42 touchdowns, while completing over 65% of his passes. But the crazy part is that Marshall was doing all of this while playing in the MAC, against teams that were specifically game planning to stop their passing attack every single week. What's really impressive about Leftwich is that he was the guy who helped establish Marshall as a legitimate program. The success they had in the early 2000s, the bowl victories, the national recognition, a lot of that started with what Leftwich was doing as the quarterback. The really frustrating part about Leftwich's college career is that he was playing for a program that was still building its reputation. Marshall wasn't getting the national television coverage, they weren't getting the recruiting attention, and they weren't getting the respect that their performance on the field deserved. Imagine if Leftwich had been playing for a major program during those years. With better talent around him, with more resources, with national television coverage every week, we might be talking about him as one of the greatest college quarterbacks of the early 2000s. Instead, he's remembered mainly as the guy who had a decent NFL career after putting up good numbers at Marshall. Brad Smith, Missouri. Now let's talk about a guy who was doing things that nobody had ever seen before. But he was doing it for a Missouri program that couldn't figure out how to win consistently. Brad Smith threw for 8,799 yards and rushed for 4,289 yards in his college career, making him one of the most versatile players in college football history. Smith wasn't just a dual-threat quarterback. He was basically playing a different position than everyone else. The guy could line up at quarterback, running back, wide receiver, or wildcat formation, and he was elite at all of them. Missouri's offense during his era was basically give Brad Smith the ball and let him figure it out. And somehow it worked more often than it should have. The 2005 season, Smith threw for 2,304 yards and 13 touchdowns, while leading the team in rushing with 1,301 yards and 16 more scores. But the crazy part is that Missouri went 7-5 that season, which shows you how limited the team was. Smith was putting up wild numbers, and they still couldn't win games. What made Smith special was his athleticism and his football IQ. The guy could read defenses like a veteran quarterback, but he also had the speed to outrun defensive backs and the power to run through linebackers. He was basically Tim Tebow before Tim Tebow, but he was doing it for a program that didn't have the resources to maximize his talents. Missouri during Smith's era was always dangerous, but never quite good enough to break through in the Big 12. They'd beat a ranked team one week and then lose to Kansas the next week. Smith would have an incredible performance, and somehow the defense would give it all back in the fourth quarter. When you look back at Smith's college career, he was ahead of his time by about 5 years. The concepts he was running, the versatility he brought to the offense, the way he could impact the game in multiple ways, all of that would be considered normal today. But in the mid-2000s, most coaches didn't know how to use a player like that effectively. Imagine if Smith had been playing for a team like Florida or Texas during those years. With better coaching, with more talent around him, with a defense that could occasionally make stops, we might be talking about him as one of the most revolutionary players in college football history. Instead, he's remembered mainly as a guy who had some good moments at Missouri before having a decent NFL career. Jared Lorenzen, Kentucky. Let's talk about one of the most unique quarterbacks in college football. Jared Lorenzen at Kentucky was listed at 6 feet 4 inches and 285 pounds, but he was probably closer to 300, and somehow this guy was putting up numbers that were absolutely incredible while playing for Kentucky teams that had no business being competitive in the SEC. Lorenzen threw for 10,354 yards in his college career and had 78 touchdown passes. But more importantly, he was doing it while playing for a Kentucky program that was historically terrible at football. The guy was basically trying to single-handedly drag Kentucky to respectability, and somehow he almost made it work. The 2002 season was Lorenzen's best from a team perspective. He threw for 2,267 yards and 24 touchdowns against SEC defenses that were loaded with future NFL players. Kentucky went 4-8 that season, but without Lorenzen, they probably would have gone winless. You might try to argue that his freshman season was stronger statistically, as it included significantly more passing yards, but his touchdown to interception rate was awful at 19 touchdowns to 21 interceptions. The team's record reflected the wildness of his game early on. What made Lorenzen special wasn't just his arm strength, though he could throw the ball through a brick wall. It was his accuracy and his ability to read defenses. The guy understood the game at a level that most college quarterbacks never reach, and he had this knack for making throws that looked impossible given his size and mobility limitations. Kentucky during Lorenzen's era was always the underdog, always expected to lose, and somehow Lorenzen kept them competitive in games they had no business being in. He once threw for over 500 yards and 2 touchdowns against Georgia, and Kentucky still lost the game. The really crazy part about Lorenzen's college career is that he was doing all of this while being constantly criticized for his weight and his mobility. People would make jokes about him being too big to play quarterback, but then he'd go out and throw for 350 yards playing backyard football and giving everything he had to try and will his team to victory. What's interesting to think about is that Lorenzen was probably the most talented quarterback Kentucky had during his era, but he was playing for a program that was the doormat of the SEC. Kentucky's offensive line was terrible, their running game was non-existent, and their defense was historically bad. Imagine if Lorenzen had been playing for a team like LSU or Alabama during those years. With a decent offensive line, with a running game that could keep defenses honest, with a defense that could put up a consistent fight, we might be talking about him as one of the most unique success stories in college football history. Instead, he's remembered mainly as the big quarterback who had some good moments at Kentucky before becoming a cult hero in the NFL. Look, these guys we've talked about represent something that's kind of heartbreaking about college football. Talent doesn't always end up in the right places, and sometimes the most incredible performances happen when nobody's really watching. These weren't guys who got to play for Alabama or Ohio State with 5-star recruits at every position. These were guys who had to carry terrible teams on their backs and somehow make magic happen anyway. Subscribe if you want more forgotten legends, because college football history is full of guys who deserve way more recognition than they got.